The bulk of the lesson will come out of Daniel chapter 1 and Daniel chapter 6. So if you'll be turning to Daniel chapter 1. The title of the lesson is Unshakeable Devotion from the book of Daniel. In Daniel, the book opens with him as a young man getting taken away from his homeland into captivity, into the land of the Babylonians. Immediately, there, starting in verse 8, we see that he is immediately brought to the temptation of giving in and moving away from the customs of his people and eating the food that God had once commanded them. So what was the big deal of not eating the king's food in the first place? This food, coming from this foreign king, would not have been food that God had deemed as clean food when God gave the law to Moses, but it would have been food that would have been good to the eye. Daniel knew that him eating this food from the king is going to go against the food that God had told his people to eat. But there in verse 8, we see that Daniel, with regards to the food, had already taken a commitment to the food he was going to eat before he was brought to the temptation. Daniel 1 verse 8 reads, "But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with a portion of the king's delicacies, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the chief of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself." When we are trying to make a decision under stress, any action that we take needs to be planned. This is why in every building every public building we have today, we have fire escape plans. It removes the need to be able to think of the next step and enables the person to be able to move directly into action. In the same manner, Daniel resolved or purposed in his heart to remain undefiled. He had made up his mind to obey the things of God over the things of man far before he was told to eat the king's food. His devotion was not reactionary, but it was predecided. When the decisions are left up to be reactionary, there are usually choices where, in hindsight, we think of the different, better ways we could have handled the situation. But in calm times, when we don't have a challenge ahead of us that we must immediately handle, we can have the luxury of thinking of the different outcomes of the choices we make. This is the decision making that Daniel had done even at his young age. It would have been God's way or no other way. So we see here in this first verse that faithfulness is a choice made long before temptation appears. It is something that we must decide for ourselves long before it is needed. In comparison with that to the New Testament Christians must prepare their hearts in advance. In Psalms 119, verse 11, "Your word I have hidden in my heart, that I may not sin against you." And we also see that spiritual strength is built through daily commitment, and that's shown in Acts chapter 2, verses 46 and 47, when the New Testament Christians gather daily. Devotion is seen in daily faithfulness. Moving to Daniel chapter 6. Daniel chapter 6, verses 4 through 5. We see that Daniel was trustworthy in his work. This would translate to us very directly. We can see the principles of Daniel's work ethic and apply them to our own lives. He was not in the place he wanted to be. He was in a foreign nation, not the job he wanted as he was growing up, working under a foreign king as a eunuch, but he still worked honestly and to his best ability, and because of that, the king promoted him up and had a mind to place him over all the kingdom. We read that in Daniel 6 and verse 3. But as it usually does, worldly success drives jealousy from those who are worldly minded. His enemies could find no fault in him except for his faith and devotion to God. They were looking at all of Daniel's life, and in verse 4 we see that they were looking for something that Daniel did that could be seen as against the king or against the kingdom as a whole. But Daniel was a very faithful servant to the king and seemingly had accepted his role in what he could do in God's plan. True devotion, we see, affects every aspect of your life. Just as Daniel, he was not a double-sided man, following the commandments of the king one day and speaking ill of the kingdom the next. It is evident that he was not doing that in Daniel 4 or Daniel 6 and verse 4. We are not to be godly people on Sunday and worldly people on Monday. Luke chapter 16 and verse 13, it reads, "No servant can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will hold to one and despise the other. Yet ye cannot serve God and mammon." We are told in Titus 2 and verse 12, teaching us that denying ungodliness and worldly lust, we should live soberly, righteously, and godly in our present age. That verse doesn't apply to only our Sundays, but rather our lives. Our faith should be visible in our integrity. Matthew 5 and verse 16. "Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven." In Matthew 7:19 through 20. "Every tree that does not bear good fruits is cut down and thrown into the fire. Therefore, by their fruits you will know them." Devotion is sustained through prayer. The portion of this text is Daniel chapter 6, verses 10 and 11. The context of this is the kings, satraps, and princes, the high-ranking officials under the king, had devised a plan to make it so that no one in the kingdom could worship their own God, but rather they could only pray to the king himself. They did this because they knew that Daniel was righteous in all that he did, and the only thing that they could trap him on was his devotion to Daniel's God. So, in that context, we see that Daniel prayed as he always had. He did not alter his worship to avoid trouble. Daniel didn't hide in an inner room in his house, or close the doors, or even say a silent prayer while walking or working. Instead, verse 10, it tells us that he was in his house with his windows open toward Jerusalem. He was on his knees praying, not once but 3 times a day, which was his custom. Daniel knew that the king would be forced to throw him into the lion's den, as the king would not or could not rescind the law once it was passed. It was a custom of the Medes and the Persians. Once a decree or law went out, even the king himself could not overturn that law. So, effectively, at the end of verse 12 of Daniel chapter 6, Daniel was signing his own death sentence. Daniel understood that prayer was a central aspect, not just a convenience. Prayer was never an option, but rather a great ability that we have, that we can be able to talk or take our cares, the worries of life, the troubles we have, to bring them to God that created all things. Not only do we know that as Christians, as God's people, he will listen, but that he is waiting to hear from us. Psalms 40 and verse 1 reads, I waited patiently for the Lord, and he inclined to me and heard my cry. 1 John 5:14 through 15. Now this is the confidence that we have in him, that if we ask anything according to his will, he hears us, and if we know that he hears us, whatever we ask, we know that we have the petitions that we have asked of him. Prayer is essential to spiritual endurance. 1 Thessalonians 5:17 reads simply, pray without ceasing. Faithfulness to God outweighs what fear man may cause. Acts 5:29, we ought to obey God rather than men. Devotion, trust God with the outcome. In Daniel 6:16 through 23, it tells us how Daniel obeyed God and left the results in God's hand. In the story of Daniel, it continues, Daniel's enemy go to the king and tell the king that Daniel has broken this new law. The king, by way of the law, is forced to uphold the law and throw Daniel into the lion's den, a certain death. He would spend a night in the lion's den with lions that were only there to punish the people that broke the law. They would have been given just enough food to live, but never enough so that they weren't hungry. Daniel, who most scholars would place in his early 80s, would be trapped in the lion's den with these starved beasts. Daniel, being in his 80s, wouldn't have had a chance to protect himself. His faith and devotion to God put his outcome in God's hands. God's deliverance brought glory to his name. As we see Daniel and the king speaking just before Daniel goes into the lion's den in verse 16, the king says, thy God whom thou servest continually, he will deliver thee. We see that the king was greatly stressed all night, and as the morning broke, the king actually ran to check on Daniel. I think the fact that the king ran to the den and hoped Daniel was still alive speaks of the magnitude of the faith that Daniel showed. There's a saying we sometimes say, we may be the only Bible someone ever reads. The king knew that Daniel worshipped a different God and hoped that Daniel was still alive. Daniel did not defend himself, but God did. As the stone was moved that morning and the king called out to Daniel, asking if Daniel's God had spared him, Daniel answers the king, saying that God had shut the mouths of the lions and had spared him. Daniel was unharmed from the lion's den, and the Bible says in verse 23, it's because he trusted God, no manner of hurt was found on him. Obedience is our responsibility. Outcomes belong to God. We see that in Daniel 3:16 through 18. It's the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They had said that after they hadn't bowed down to the golden idol that Nebuchadnezzar had set up, they had said that if it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of thy hand, O king. But if not, be it known to thee, O king, that we will not serve thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. So, trusting God strengthens our faith and witnesses. So just as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's faith had led Nebuchadnezzar to the understanding that the one true God is real and is Jehovah, so had Daniel's example shown King Darius the same thing. And we see that in devotion brings influence and testimony. Daniel 6:25 through 27. Daniel was honored before the pagan nation. verses 25 through 27, the king made a new declaration that went out to all the kingdom, that the God of Daniel is the living God and steadfast, and his kingdom will not be destroyed. One man's faithfulness influenced a king and a kingdom. Let us remember Daniel's life, his devotion, and his faith was just one man, taken from his own land as a young man, who believed in God and kept the faith, and he was able to lead the king of the most powerful nation on earth to believing that Jehovah is God. Faithful Christians can impact the world around them. Acts 14, verse 6. But when they did not find them, they dragged Jason and some of the brethren to the rulers of the city, crying out, "These who have turned the world upside down have come here too." Our devotion points others to God. 1 Peter 2 and verse 12. Having your conduct honorable among the Gentiles, that they may speak against you as evildoers, that when they speak against you as evildoers, that they may, by your good works which they observe, glorify God in the day of visitation. As we approach the conclusion, we see that Daniel showed us what devotion to God is. Devotion is intentional. Daniel made up his mind to follow after God even when it was unlawful. Devotion is consistent. No punishment from a new law was able to shake the faith of Daniel. Devotion has prayer at its core. We must be like Daniel and the New Testament Christians, praying without ceasing, 1 Thessalonians 5:17. And devotion is courageous. Matthew 10:28. Be not afraid of them that kill the body, but are not able to kill the soul, but rather fear him who is able to destroy both soul and body in hell. So, as I've given you the lesson, if there's any need to obey the gospel, as Mark 16:16 says, he that believeth and is baptized shall be saved, but he that believeth not shall be condemned. If anyone needs to respond to the gospel call, or if a Christian here needs to ask for repentance and prayer from the church, please stand as we sing.